Now that the 2023 elections are over, we can finally shift focus towards the Republican primaries and the upcoming 2024 presidential election, because even though we have Donald Trump well in the lead, there's still a lot of volatility in this primary because Donald Trump is still not over 50% in a lot of these key battleground states. He's under 50%, and there is a lot of volatility having to do with the indictments and all of that, and many are unsure if Donald Trump will even end up making it to the nomination with all of his legal woes and all the business pertaining to that. So that's why I cover the Republican primaries a lot. Obviously, Trump is the favorite, but there is always the chance for a major shakeup given the fact that we really are in uncharted territory with a former president indicted with 91 criminal charges. So it's very much a first in our politics. But today we're going to talk about some breaking news that came out of Iowa on Monday. Now, this got overshadowed by the 2023 election occurring the next day, all the news pertaining to that. We didn't talk about it, but Governor Kim Reynolds broke precedent in Iowa as governor. You know, normally Republican governors stay out of the Iowa caucuses, but she actually broke this precedent to endorse Ron DeSantis. So we're going to talk about this as well as the implications for the Reynolds endorsement and just an overview of the Iowa caucuses now that we are less than 3 months away. So as always, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this is a first for a Iowa governor. No Iowa governor has intervened in a Republican caucus like this before. There was very little warning for this. I mean, it was pretty obvious that Reynolds probably wasn't going to endorse Donald Trump. I think it was really down between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Kristi has been also in sort of a similar position. He's a governor of a key early primary state. Obviously, Kim Reynolds is the governor of the First in the Nation caucus, so really, really important, the first state that actually votes in the primaries. And of course, Kristi in New Hampshire. But both of these governors up until recently have stayed out of the primaries. Kristi has obviously made it very clear that he's not interested in Donald Trump being nominee. He did a rally with Nikki Haley. Some speculate he's close to endorsing her, but he has also been very friendly to Ron DeSantis, doing campaigns for Ron DeSantis around New Hampshire. So both of these early primary state governors made it sort of clear that they're not going to endorse Donald Trump in the Republican primary. And, you know, Kim Reynolds was sort of a holdout for a while. There was a lot of speculation, but of course, Monday she broke tradition and ended up endorsing Ron DeSantis. Now, her reason for doing so is she cited Ron DeSantis as somebody who can stop the moral decline of our country, who looks to the future, not the past, and somebody who, most importantly, can win. And that's really the biggest argument that I've heard in favor of Ron DeSantis, is that he's more electable than Donald Trump. And certainly, if you look at the 2022 elections in Florida, that very much is the case. Now, national Democrats, Florida Democrats didn't really put a whole lot of money in Florida, but they did that because of the uncompetitive nature of the race. Ron DeSantis was incredibly popular. He was crushing in the polls, and he ended up winning re-election by nearly 20 percentage points. Pretty much unprecedented for a Republican in the state. Now, Kim Reynolds is also a very popular Republican governor. She won re-election in 2018 by nearly 20 percentage points. She won her last election by, I think, only 3. So Kim Reynolds is somebody who's also popular with Iowa Republicans. In fact, she has a higher favorability in Iowa among Republicans, over 80%, than Donald Trump does, which is just 66%. And if we take a look at the RCP average of the caucus polling, Donald Trump is up by around 30 percentage points. So that's a pretty big lead, but he's still under 50%. Now, the only thing is, we don't have a lot of time before the caucuses for things to really change. So I'm saying this in terms of the other candidates. But theoretically, if all the other candidates dropped out and coalesced behind one candidate and their support also coalesced, you would have essentially a pretty close contest in Iowa. So these polls indicate to me that over half of Iowa Republican caucus goers are looking for somebody other than Donald Trump to lead the party. Now, the real question is, who's going to be that candidate? Because it's very clear at this rate, if all of the current candidates stay in the race, Donald Trump is going to cruise to the nomination. Now, if Republicans were actually serious about stopping Donald Trump from winning the nomination, as there are many in the party whose interest it is to do that, you would want to coalesce around one candidate. We saw this effect during Super Tuesday or before Super Tuesday in the Democratic primaries in 2020. It looked like Bernie Sanders was on track to win the nomination. He was doing well in all the early states. Joe Biden was at 8% in New Hampshire. And all of a sudden, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, drop out of the race. They endorsed Joe Biden, and Elizabeth Warren, who sort of occupied that progressive lane with Bernie Sanders, stayed in the race and sort of screwed him out of the nomination effectively. So when you had a coalition of the more establishment Democrats like that, you ended up having Biden becoming the nominee because he drove it home in South Carolina, made it to Super Tuesday, and he crushed it on Super Tuesday. So the Democrats were able to come together and say that we want Joe Biden as our nominee. We don't think Bernie Sanders is electable. And as a result, they made some phone calls, they scratched some backs, and they got what they wanted. Now, if the Republican Party was as effective and savvy as the Democratic Party, they would be orchestrating the same thing now, because there are many people in the Republican Party that are concerned when you have a former president who's historically unpopular, who has 91 criminal charges against him, on track to win the nomination. That's almost a sure loss in the general election. Now, Donald Trump has always been somebody who's surprised people and exceeded expectations, so that's really the wild card in all of this. But there are many within the Republican Party that have Trump fatigue and are looking for somebody else to talk more about the future instead of trying to relitigate the 2020 election, go back to the past, and somebody who's actually going to be a formidable force against Joe Biden, because Donald Trump has already proven he's lost to Joe Biden in 2020. So if anything, he's not the strongest candidate in this primary. Certainly, I think there's other candidates who would do much better against Joe Biden. Now, whether or not they should be the nominee from a Republican conservative standpoint is another issue entirely, and that's certainly debatable when you go into the policies. You've certainly got more centrist Republicans running this time around, Kristi, Asa Hutchinson, for instance, much more in that center lane. You have Nikki Haley sort of in that more neoconservative lane, and then you have Ron DeSantis sort of in that conservative traditionalist lane. And that really leaves Donald Trump in his sort of populist, blue collar, white working class lane in the Republican primary. That's always been his strongest constituency. So looking at Iowa, again, Donald Trump has a massive lead, but of course Kim Reynolds is hoping that this boost in support will convince a lot of Iowa caucus voters to sort of drop some of these lower tier candidates, Tim Scott, Mike Pence, who's already dropped out. Now, he endorsed Nikki Haley, Doug Burgum, who should be dropped out at this point, coalescing support around Ron DeSantis, somebody who is still second place in most of these states, even though he has fallen considerably. It just seems logical that he would be the next runner-up. Now, the Donald Trump campaign has done a pretty good job at knocking down Ron DeSantis' favorabilities. And you see that with a number of scandals online. They're talking about Ron DeSantis' boots. There's just sort of a troll campaign at this point to try and knock him down. But it has been working. And, Donald Trump is and isn't taking the primary seriously. I think there are many in Trump world that are sort of taking the primary seriously, in the sense that if Donald Trump is the nominee, if he doesn't become president, there's obviously massive implications with his legal troubles. I think Trump is really banking on the fact that he wins the primary and wins the presidency before he can get indicted and thrown in jail. So this is really a do or die moment for him. That's why I think the Trump campaign has been increasingly desperate over the past few months, especially since this is it. If Donald Trump doesn't win this, he's done. His life is essentially over. He'll be in jail. One way or the other. 91 criminal charges. It's almost impossible for him to get off on every single one of those charges. And that's something that Kristi actually brought up on Joe Scarborough a couple days ago. So the walls are really closing in. This is why I've always said this is a very volatile primary, because we've never had something like this. We've never had the leader of the Republican Party effectively rattled with indictments, rattled with scandal, historic unapproval ratings. Yet his approvals, the people that actually do support of Donald Trump, are the most devoted and fanatical supporters we've probably ever seen in U.S. politics. So it's really just a crazy mashup in the 2024 primaries. And of course, we're all here for it, watching every step of it. But, this endorsement, we'll see how much of an effect it has. Kim Reynolds is the governor of the first of the nation caucus state, so you'd think it would carry some weight. The Trump campaign has already come out and tried to belittle Kim Reynolds and downplay the endorsement, and they very well could be right. It really just depends what the polling actually is. But I think it's not too controversial to say that up until this point, Ron DeSantis has sort of underperformed expectation. Ever since the very beginning, I think there was an expectation that Ron DeSantis would do a lot better in this primary. And so far, again, it's not over, but it's not looking very good. I think the best case scenario for DeSantis would have been right after the midterms, announced for president, get support early, coalesce support even before the run, even before the midterms. Although the midterms, I think, really sealed the deal in the sense that it created such a contrast between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis' record was success, was electoral victories, was positive coattails. Donald Trump did not have that. And hasn't had that since 2016 effectively. So that was the time to make the contrast, not many months later in May when Ron DeSantis had already lost a lot of steam, when he already toyed around with running for president, whether he wasn't, ended up jumping into the race. He should have announced right then and there. I honestly think that would have been better than waiting until after the legislative session, because then he would have had all the momentum, all the energy. You could have had these endorsements come out. If you had people like Kim Reynolds come out for DeSantis early, it would have been a death punch to the Trump campaign, but that's not what happened. And again, you looked at Trump's announcement speech, very low energy. He wasn't 2016, it wasn't 2020, so that would have been DeSantis's moment. And I think as of right now, it's almost too late for him to make a real impact. But anyway, that's my analysis on the situation. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.